If you've ever watched a martial arts movie or played a video game featuring martial arts, then surely you've heard of the ninja archetype. And ninjutsu itself is a special type of martial art that is shrouded in mystery, mysticism, and all sorts of belief systems. But what if I told you that Black Americans are more similar to the mystical elements of the ninja, even more so than the people who actually practice ninjutsu? Like, for example, some people say that Black Americans in particular have a version of telepathy, which is called Black American nonverbal communication, but this is an example of an ability that ninjas were said to have, but we were the ones that actually perfected this ability. And some call it Black American nonverbal communication, but others call it The Shining.
Just say it. Just say it.
Titanic.
All black people have the shine. It's kind of like Facebook.
In fact, our infiltration and spy skills were always so great to the point where without those skills, the United States as a country would not exist because it was a slave named James Armistead Lafayette who served as a double agent that was feeding the Continental Army and George Washington all of the information from the British Army and then turn around and giving the British Army information that was incorrect. And some might say that we are not comparable to ninja because we don't have our own hand-to-hand combat fighting styles. But actually, Black Americans do have various fighting styles, such as the 52 blocks. This is not anime logic. This is not race mysticism. This is not some goofy claim that Black Americans are a supernatural people with hidden bloodline abilities. No, instead, this is a historical argument and an argument about what kinds of habits, instincts, social technologies, and adaptive behaviors get produced when a people are forced to survive slavery, surveillance, anti-literacy laws, segregation, racial terror, and chronic social danger for centuries. When most people say ninja, they usually are not using the narrowest historical definition of Japanese shinobi, but instead they are referring to an archetype. They're talking about stealth, hidden knowledge, coded communication, adaptive intelligence, bodily control, ritual protection, improvising, and the ability to survive on hostile territory without exposing too much of the self. And when you look at Black American history through that lens, the comparison of ninjutsu and Black Americans begins to make a surprising amount of sense. So the thesis of this video is simple, and that is Black Americans are not Japanese ninja, but Black American culture produced something strikingly close to the ninja archetype, and that is a people trained by history to survive through code, rhythm, concealment, spirit, and discipline. The reason why this comparison hits is not because Black Americans are magical, but instead it is because the historical conditions forced an unusually deep development of strategic survival culture.
I don't know if you can think of a people who were more held back, more deprived, more sabotaged than African Americans. You took everything away from them and took them away from everything. They started in your country at less than zero, literally regarded and treated as subhuman, not allowed to learn to read or write or anything for hundreds of years. But you see, they come from a people of accomplishment to one degree or another. Not a people of piracy and theft and appropriation. They come from a people who created and built and developed in their own land. And even though you did everything that you could possibly do to suppress them, to hold them down, to hold them back, and you're still doing that until today, nevertheless, I don't think anyone can dispute the fact that African Americans have become a global cultural superpower.
One of the first direct comparisons is the mind itself. W.E.B. Du Bois described Black life in America through double consciousness, or the feeling of always measuring oneself through the eyes of a society that views Black people with suspicion, contempt, or pity. Britannica summarizes this through Du Bois's famous language of two-ness, or being both oneself and constantly forced to see oneself as an object through the eyes of others. The reason why this matters is because it describes a survival psychology and not just a literary phrase. A person who is not under constant social pressure can move more casually, and that person can speak without as much calculation. they can react without constantly asking how that reaction will be interpreted. But a people shaped by racial domination do not get that luxury. They learn to read the room while standing inside of it. They learn to watch the watcher while being watched. They learn to anticipate how posture, tone, clothing, words, and even silence will be interpreted by authority. And once you understand that framework, a lot of Black American social behavior stops looking random. You can see the guardedness. You can see the instinct to fill out a room before saying too much. There is an awareness that what you feel and what you can safely show are not always the same thing. That is not just personality. It is historical training. Black survival begins with the mind learning to carry more without collapsing under the strain. That is one of the deepest ninja parallels in the entire video, because the ninja archetype is built around a person who cannot move through the world naively. And both Black Americans and ninjas were people who survived by carrying more awareness than the people around them realized. And W.E.B. Du Bois, long before pop culture ever used the word ninja this way, was already describing a population shaped by exactly that condition.
Let's unpack this again. Here's me, here's the other world. Why can't we just get along? Why? There's this unasked question. What's the unasked question? How does it feel to be a problem? Or for me, the contemporary question really is, what's it like to be Black? Everybody in this room is smart enough to know. Racial tension is all in the body language. Oh, body language. I mean, sometimes it's words, it's the body language. Everybody's reading it, and that's how you know it's awkward. He says, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. So you understand yourself through the way that white people see you. That's how you see you. It's how white people see you. That's the doubleness. And you recognize this isn't really my world. This isn't really my neighborhood. This isn't really my school. This isn't really my church. This isn't mine. I know that. And so I have to abide by two sets of rules. One, to accommodate the way white people see me, and one, to just figure out who I am.
A lot of Black Americans talk about reading the room, catching danger early, noticing when something is off, spotting hypocrisy fast, or sensing a shift in energy before anybody else seems to notice. And there is a temptation to mythologize that, but this is not race magic. This is survival intelligence shaped by repeated exposure to unequal conditions. A people living under threat become more attentive. They monitor more. They scan more. They anticipate more. They often learn caution before the danger becomes fully visible. And I have a practical example with that. Like, for example, when I was growing up, my mother would either get us involved in the police explorer programs, or she would just flat out tell the cops to not come to our house. And some people might say that was crazy and that's silly to even talk to the cops like that, but there was a reason for that. Because we knew if the law would show up, they would often not help Black people in South Carolina, of all places. But there was a problem with police brutality. And so if you can't rely on the cops in the first place, then why in the hell would you want them around at all? Or you'll notice how Black Americans will drive slower than the posted speed limit and will put on their cruise control just so they don't get pulled over by cops. Because driving while Black has always been a thing in this country ever since we got cars. And so with behavior like that, you can see the double consciousness. And later on, we'll get into code switching, but this double consciousness that W.E.B. Du Bois talked about is definitely a survival tactic, but it's more than that, because these tactics would not be necessary if there were not an anticipation of danger. And so the only reason why this behavior is so effective in terms of having Black Americans in the right mindset to live under a system of white supremacy is because white supremacy is predictable. And so we know this country is always going to be racist, and so we act accordingly. Black vigilance may look impressive from the outside, but it comes at a cost. This is not a comic book superpower. This is what happens to people who were oppressed and still being oppressed, but learn how to adapt and overcome. It's just that white supremacy also adapts, and so it appears to be a never-ending struggle. At no point in this video will I claim that Black Americans are superhuman, but instead, the point is that history trained our people to become unusually alert, and that alertness is a part of survival tradition. If double consciousness describes what happens in the mind, then the next question is, what does that pressure look like when it enters communication?
As a Black person, I love like all the non-verbal communications that we do to each other. Like you can be in a random place, not know another Black person at all, and y'all both will peep some bullshit, and y'all both will just go. Like instantly the context is understood, and we have a whole conversation without using words. It's like unmatched, bro.
Sinners. Is it?
Yes.
No, it's not.
Weird. Look, that's crazy, bitch.
Oh shit.
Why you did that? That was
No, that's just too Black.
What should I do? Girl. 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 You're right.
And ironically, I use the ninja comparison to Black Americans because it makes so much sense, because there's an anime called Naruto, right? In this anime, there is this ninja clan called the Yamanaka clan, and they are known to have this technique called Haijutsu, which is basically a type of spiritual force or magic that is linked to the human and animal mind, and they can use telepathy. And while this ability isn't considered a bloodline ability, it is rarely taught outside of the Yamanaka clan. And many of them appear to have proficiency and talent in this ability innately. And the funniest part about that is that there is no other medium in which I could accurately compare to Black American nonverbal communication, which many Americans refer to as Black American telepathy.
We're gonna have to start making telepathy our first language again, y'all. Yeah, yeah. Because as much as we want to have a safe space for us on the internet and these other places, it just ain't gonna work, because there's always gonna be a skin folk that ain't kin folk that's gonna invite these people into these spaces that we create for ourselves. Always. And one thing I know that these people cannot infiltrate is the way that we telepathically communicate with one another. I've never seen it happen. And that's another way that we're gonna be able to figure out the people that look like us if they are with us. The way that they communicate with us telepathically, if they can do that, okay, all right. But if they can't, we know. We know you're not with us. You're not down with us. And once we start doing that shit, y'all, whew, it will just make us more peaceful. It'll make the world a better place once we start communicating back the way that we originally were. What y'all think?
This is an ability that cannot be taught, because I've never been taught how to use Black American nonverbal communication. This ability appears to be epigenetic in nature. And I mean, you can just Google it. There are no classes on this particular language. And yet Black Americans who have a lineage to American slavery in this country appear to all have this same ability. And it's called different things, you know, the shining or Black American nonverbal communication or Black American telepathy. And some people also call it a version of the gift or the ability to use psychic powers within the Black American mythology space. But I'm not worried about the supernatural. I'm worried about the more grounded explanation for this seemingly supernatural ability that is completely natural, but is so rare to see a language so developed that cannot be taught, but can be so easily understood by tens of millions of people.
You want the fucking rules, Lisa? Yes.
You talking to me?
Yes.
Yo, this is trippy. I didn't think this mind talk can work for the guys, but go ahead.
I need you to hit him low.
Wait a minute, what?
I said hit him low, and I'm gonna hit him high. Choose one of them.
Choose one of them. Choose one of them, Lisa.
He's crazy, are you sure?
Yes, nigga, I'm sure.
You heard me. I choose myself.
Okay.
I refuse to play your game.
Wait, did you hear all of that?
Yes, motherfucker, I did. You done fucked up now.
Black Americans have developed forms of nonverbal communication that outsiders often notice but do not fully understand. And I'm gonna tell you, many of us don't understand it completely ourselves, but our eyes and our brains can just interpret these body gestures, and some of the gestures can say a whole paragraph with a mere facial expression. And sometimes it's a look or a nod or a pause or a side eye or a certain tightening of the face or a particular greeting or a shift in posture that sometimes, once again, can often mean more than a paragraph. The Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture describes this language as a series of gestures that is both complex and powerful. And that is exactly why, to outsiders, Black American nonverbal communication can sometimes look almost telepathic.
I went to the store, Aldi specifically, because you know, when you shop at Aldi's, you have to put a quarter in to use their basket. And then when you're done shopping, you take the basket back, you get your quarter. Okay. So I was going to Aldi's and I'm walking through the parking lot and it's a couple people with me. Not with me, but you know, they walking in the parking lot too, white people. And it's some people coming out the store and I noticed they all white, you know, we in Oklahoma, but it is one black woman with them. So they walking out, we walking in. The black woman stops and she looks through the parking lot. She catches my eye. She go. And I'm like, and so we keep walking towards each other, and then when we get up on each other, she passed the basket off. I'm like, thank you. She say, and we just keep walking. And I'm thinking, y'all, I love that so bad because it's just me and her. Everybody else is, you know, them. And it's like, I see you, you see me, we see each other.
It's not literal telepathy. It's not paranormal power, but instead a dense, high context, and embodied signaling system built on shared cultural experience. And that's why this language is exclusive to Black Americans who descend from chattel slavery here. And you may be wondering, where in the world did this language come from? Well, back during slavery, slaves were often scrutinized if they would meet up and start having conversations. And you see that even now, because let 4 or 5 black men just stand around in a mostly white city and just have a conversation. And if that conversation goes on long enough, you'll get some random white people walk up and just start asking questions. And they'll act all friendly, but the reason for the questioning is not friendly in nature. And instead, these white people are behaving like Karens. And so if you see that even now in the modern day, well, what do you think was happening during slavery? And that's precisely why Black American nonverbal communication was developed, because you had slaves who had to escape or pass along messages or arm themselves to prepare to take over a plantation or do all sorts of things. And sometimes it was unwise to speak tongues that was outside of English, because eventually, if you keep speaking in a certain way, the slave masters would eventually understand the language or someone could turn on you. And so if you have Black American nonverbal communication among Black American slaves who were, let's just say, not exactly the house Negro type, well, that allowed you to pass along messages without being betrayed and also without being noticed. And you see modern day parodies of this, like for example, Key and Peele did a parody of the Black American nonverbal communication, and in the modern day, some people call this version of what some would say is telepathy, The Shining.
All black people have the shine. It's kind of like Facebook.
And in this episode of Key and Peele, you had this comedy sketch where this newly hired black office worker meets this other black person who works in the same office, and this other black person is sending him almost telepathic messages through body language.
Wow, Denzel Washington?
And this person starts hearing from Barack Obama, and then Kobe Bryant, and then all sorts of other people, as if to suggest that black people actually have telepathy. The reason why this parody lands is because it exaggerates a recognizable cultural pattern and pushes that pattern into the absurdity for comedy purposes. But the reason why audiences instantly get it is because the underlying pattern is real. And then you have certain other gestures like the dap. And the dap is not just a handshake. The Smithsonian traces it back to black soldiers in Vietnam, where the dap handshake functioned as a gesture of recognition, solidarity, dignity, and black consciousness under dangerous conditions. Because this was not just about expressiveness or just being different, because you had some black Americans who were defectors. This is incredibly close to the ninja archetype in the popular sense because of the silent recognition, the compressed signal, and communication of obvious or noticeable speech. The body speaks because sometimes the body has to say what the tongue cannot safely say yet. The comparison of Black Americans to ninja may seem silly, but one of the signature abilities of the ninja is disguise. And the ninja are said to have these magical abilities to disguise themselves as tree logs or animals or just common objects. And even in the Naruto anime that I mentioned before, they have this magical ability called jutsu. And in that show, you have the transformation jutsu where the ninja can transform into all sorts of things as a method of concealment. And also, this is useful in stealth tactics. And what if I told you that Black Americans have something very, very similar in the form of this phenomenon where Black Americans are masters of disguise? And chattel slavery serves as evidence of this because there's a long list of Black Americans who I would argue are better masters of disguise than even the ninja. And I'm not comparing Black Americans to ninja in the literal sense, but in the deeper sense of controlling how one is perceived in hostile territory. In popular imagination, the ninja survives by concealment, deception, role shifting, and the ability to move through enemy space without being fully recognized. For Black Americans born into or directly descended from chattel slavery in the United States, disguise could mean the difference between bondage and freedom, capture and escape, or life and death. The most famous and dramatic example is Ellen Craft. The National Park Service explains that Ellen, who was enslaved in Georgia and described as having a very light skin complexion, escaped in 1848 with her husband, William Craft. The reason why she had a very light skin complexion despite being a Black woman is because her father was also her enslaver and a white man, and her mother was a Black slave. And what makes Ellen Craft so special is that she is a master of disguise.
Ellen Craft, an enslaved woman and seamstress living in this house in Macon, Georgia. She was the daughter of an enslaved woman who had been impregnated by her white enslaver.
When Ellen Craft was 11 years old, her mother, Maria, had to watch as her daughter was given away as a wedding gift to her enslaver's oldest daughter.
So this was her half-sister?
This was her half-sister, yes.
Wow. In her early 20s, Craft married an enslaved man.
And so in 1848, Ellen came up with a brilliant plan. You see, Ellen wore men's clothing. She wrapped up part of her face. She wore some green spectacles. She put one of her arms in an arm sling, and then she pretended to be sick as she posed as an old, sick, white slave owner. And the reason why she wanted to pretend to be sick is because people would be less likely to expect long conversation or written signatures from her. This disguise worked because it did more than alter clothing. Her disguise altered class signals, gender signals, race signals, and expectations about who could command and who must obey. William Craft, who was Ellen Craft's husband, was posing as her slave, and so the two of them traveled openly by train and steamboat through spaces where a Black couple moving together would have invited scrutiny. And what makes this story so remarkable is that Ellen Craft had no training as an actress, and she managed to put on such a convincing performance that she not only earned her freedom, but also the freedom of her husband.
What relationship are you to William and Ellen Craft?
They are my great-great-grandparents on my mother's side.
As a child, Peggy Trotter Damon Priestley heard about the incredible journey of her great-great-grandparents.
As Black people in America, we have to wear a mask often. We can't always allow people to know what we're thinking. So this masking and this disguise and this ability to be in the room and absorb was so incredible that it enabled them throughout their 4 days of escape to encounter certain situations and figure out what to do.
Let's not mince words here. What Ellen Craft did was incredible because she had to throw her voice, change her mannerisms, change her clothing, and she couldn't make a single mistake. And mind you, she did all of this under duress. Another powerful example is Frederick Douglass, even though his disguise worked a little bit differently. The National Park Service states that in 1838, Frederick Douglass escaped from Maryland to New York while disguised as a sailor. He wore a red shirt, a tarpaulin hat, and a loosely tied black scarf. And he also carried papers borrowed from a free black sailor in order to support his own freedom.
So Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in 1818. He spent the first 20 years of his life as a slave. And in 1838, he escaped and made his way up to Massachusetts, where he worked as a laborer for a few years. And in 1841, he was discovered by the abolitionist leader William Lloyd Garrison. And Douglass gave a speech in front of Garrison when they first met. And Garrison immediately knew he had a star on his hands and invited Douglass to join the abolitionist lecture circuit. And that began a 50-plus year career as an abolitionist orator and orator on behalf of other progressive causes. And Douglass, after leaving Garrison in Massachusetts in the late 1840s, began editing his own newspapers, and he did that for quite a few years, and eventually served as a kind of informal advisor to President Lincoln.
And so what makes Frederick Douglass so different from Ellen Craft is that Frederick Douglass didn't have the convenience of almost looking white. Ellen Craft could just use her light skin as a part of her disguise, but Frederick Douglass passed as a specific kind of free black man whose appearance, job title, and movement through public space would not trigger immediate suspicion. That is still a disguise, but more in a broader tactical sense, because Frederick Douglass used class and job title because, once again, unlike Ellen Craft, his complexion didn't warrant protection. He understood how to inhabit a role convincingly enough to pass through checkpoints and institutions designed to keep people like him trapped. That is an extremely strong parallel to the ninja idea of surviving by slipping into expectations of the people watching you. Another clear example is Harriet Tubman, and she is being mentioned for more than just being a master of disguise, but also because multiple reliable histories describe her using subterfuge, altered presentation, and cover behavior as part of her work. The National Park Service describes Harriet Tubman as using many different methods and paths in her escape and slave rescue missions, and that she heavily relied on knowledge of people, place, and concealment. She was also known to use disguise as a part of her tactics, where she would change her clothes and appearance. She would move in ways that were calculated to not attract attention, and she also relied on timing and deception during her rescue work. In other words, Harriet Tubman was not just courageous, but also she was a high-level technical operator.
I think that when we look back at some of the details that Bradford includes in the account, we can sort of broaden our understanding of what might have been the possible reasons for Tubman's success. First of all, she was a remarkable person. That much is clear. She was brilliant, and she was brave. And I think that those two aspects of her character combined to make her formidable for all the people who had a bounty on her head, which was said to be as much as $12,000. She wasn't just working in one plantation. So she got to see a wide variety of contexts, different kinds of households. She got to hear different slaveholders talking about things that they observed or information that they might have been bringing to their dining room tables. And I think she was able to sort of build this broad kind of file of facts of bits of information and names and people. And I think that helped her to be able to escape for herself and then to aid others in escaping later on.
She understood that survival in hostile territory often depends on misdirection just as much as boldness. A different but equally important example is Harriet Jacobs. You see, she was born as a slave in North Carolina, and Harriet Jacobs managed to escape, but in a different way in 1835.
She was born here in Edenton in 1813, born into slavery. She managed to escape from slavery. She was a fugitive in the South. She was a fugitive in the North. After her freedom was bought, she wrote a book about her life, and she published it just just before the Civil War was started.
And the reason why I said that she escaped differently is because when Harriet escaped her slave master, she went and she hid for years in an impossibly cramped crawl space above her grandmother's porch before later fleeing north. And while her story is not a theatrical public disguise like Ellen Craft's, Harriet Jacobs only survived by controlling her visibility, manipulating what others believed about her location, and then turning her disappearance and then the rumors about her and the concealment into protective tools. In a broader sense, disguise is not only about dressing as someone else, it is also about refusing to be legible to the system hunting you. Harriet Jacobs mastered that form of invisibility. The commonality that draws these four people together is not that they all use the same trick, because they didn't. The thing that ties these four together is that they understood perception as terrain. Ellen Craft weaponized whiteness, masculinity, illness, and class appearance. Frederick Douglass weaponized occupational identity and also documentation. Harriet Tubman weaponized timing, ordinary cover behavior, and also altered presentation. Harriet Jacobs weaponized concealment, misdirection, and control of her own trace. In every case, these Black Americans, who were all directly shaped by U.S. chattel slavery, survived by mastering the gaze of the society around them. They understood that power depends on being able to identify, classify, and control your body. And so their answer was to become harder to classify and also impossible to contain. If we are going to compare Black Americans to the ninja archetype, then we have to talk about martial intelligence, or the martial art styles that Black Americans created right here in the United States. And we are not talking about a lazy stereotype about toughness. And we are also not talking about some vague claim that Black Americans are just naturally athletic and that we can all just fight. No, I mean the actual Black American fighting systems and vernacular combat traditions developed right here in the United States under the conditions of chattel slavery, plantation violence, prison culture, and the long afterlife of slavery itself. This history is well documented, and some of it survives through oral tradition and practitioner memory, but the picture is still strong. Black Americans in the United States developed fighting methods of their own, and the clearest names in the conversation are the 52 Blocks, which is a part of the broader Jailhouse Rock family, and the other dance fighting style known as knocking and kicking, with some related fighting styles such as the Barnyard appearing in practitioner histories about deeper roots. The first that we're going to talk about is the 52 Blocks, or the 52s, and this style is described by Thomas A. Green, who is a martial arts scholar, as a Black American vernacular martial art that is generally regarded as a variant of Jailhouse Rock, which is a prison-associated fighting tradition. That matters because that is not just random internet folklore. Green documents it as a real Black combat system marked by evasion, redirection, rhythm, counterfighting, and catching opponents off balance.
The two sets to make 52 blocks. Got other people, they've only shown a few. They don't even have half of the totality. Yeah, you gotta have your basic boxing game and defenses blocks down. But what about it when you're in a cell? What about training solo, training with a partner, training solo in a cell? What about knife defense?
Evading people and catching people off balance is what is required for this fighting style, because this style is not about brute force. I want you to imagine that you had Harriet Tubman and you turned Harriet Tubman into a fighting style. Well, that is essentially what 52 Blocks is, because it's also about deception, and it's also about making the other person miss, lose rhythm, and then they are going to pay for it. What makes the 52 Blocks so compelling is that it sits right at the intersection of style and function. Green explains that it draws from boxing, folk combat methods, and dance, and that it is marked by the interplay of the destructive and the artistic. In this style, movement is not just movement, rhythm is not just flair, and style is not just vanity. The looseness can disguise intent. The hand movements can break rhythm, interrupt your opponent's line of vision, or also bait reactions. The off-angle motion can create hesitation. This is why this style can look strange to people who don't understand it. But strange is not the same thing as ineffective. In fact, the oddness of this fighting style is part of what makes it so dangerous. And there's a reason why it looks so similar to modern day defensive boxing. In a real fight, once someone closes the distance, some versions of the 52 blocks use forearm frames, elbows, head control, and close range interruption, which is why some people compare it to Muay Thai once a clinch happens. And no, I'm not saying that this style is Muay Thai, but what I am saying is that once a clinch develops, some of the 52 tactics can resemble the practical realities of effective clinch fighting, and that includes posture disruption, smothering, short range control, and elbow range offense. And that is despite the fact that both traditions are historically distinct. That is the part that makes the art so fascinating. It can resemble several highly effective fighting logics at once because it was built through adaptation, remixing, and pressure rather than one clean institutional lineage.
I want to ask you about 52. Is some of that your brother or someone was teaching you some Jailhouse Rock, some 52 hands?
Daniel Marks. Yeah. See, guys.
You can see, you can see that movement there.
That's cool. You know about 52.
Yeah, and there's like this old cat with him, right? And I'm kind of watching him, and I go up to him. I'm like, I mentioned 52 or Jailhouse Rock or whatever. He looks at me like, white boy, where did you? How do you know what I'm doing over here? Yeah.
And what I'm trying to say is that through the evolution of slavery into the modern day prison system, you can see traces of 52 all throughout. And now you may be wondering, where exactly is the origins of this fighting style? Well, back during chattel slavery, you had slave masters who would take their slaves and have them fight against each other. And sometimes they would put on wagers on one slave to win over the other, which basically this is the early wave of prize fighting. And the slave masters, despite what some people might tell you, did not allow their slaves to fight to the death. Oh no, those slaves were way too expensive, but they would fight sometimes. And depending on who you were fighting against, the rules would change. And so sometimes you would have straight up boxing where you could only use fists, but sometimes you could use your elbows, your knees, kicks, and even headbutts. And so you needed a style that could adapt to all of that. And therefore you get the forefather of the 52 blocks. And then when slavery was abolished, you still had the 13th Amendment, which allowed slavery so long as someone was convicted of a crime. And so oftentimes Black Americans were unfairly targeted and put in prisons. And so the fighting system continuously developed over time with better and more efficient moves. In fact, the strongest academic claim is that some practitioners and researchers have explicitly argued that 52 comes from chattel slavery. Thomas A. Green documented those arguments seriously, and he also reported that Dennis Newsom, who was another expert, believed that the 52 blocks was a fighting system that was developed by enslaved Black Americans. And Green also records that there was another fighting style that was associated with the 52, and that was the barnyard fighting style, which Dennis Newsom associates with the time frame of Nat Turner, the famous freedom fighter. And all of that demonstrates that the broader structure is pretty obvious as to where this fighting style came from. And that would mean that the Black American martial culture didn't just come out of nowhere in modern cities. It was shaped in the shadow of plantation violence and then hardened in the penal institutions that continue controlling Black bodies after slavery. What if I told you that Black Americans have our own version of dance fighting, or capoeira? And the second style that we're going to discuss is knocking and kicking. You see, I know all about this fighting style because I know all about Black dance, and I'll get into how Black dancing with Michael Jackson and James Brown and Chris Brown and so many others is actually linked to this fighting style. But what you gotta know is that this fighting style originated in the low country of South Carolina and North Carolina and also Georgia, where you had Black slaves who were performing these dances known as the ring shout, or just ritual dances that was linked to Black American Hoodoo culture. And the slave masters incorrectly assumed that these dances were all just playtime for slaves, or just some rituals that the slaves would engage in, when the fact is Black Americans were practicing combat movements that were disguised as dancing. And the idea of knocking and kicking is partially linked to hoodoo because, like I said, this actually evolved into the ring shout dances where you have Black Americans kicking up their feet and doing high kicks and all kinds of splits and backflips and all kinds of acrobatics. And if you were to watch the knocking and kicking style in practice and you were to compare it to the Brazilian capoeira, you would see that, oh my gosh, these styles are almost virtually identical, with capoeira being more flary and a little bit faster, while the Black American knocking and kicking might be a tad bit slower, but packs way more power moves and relies on way more evasion and counter-striking. Certain scholars such as T.J. Obi has said that knocking and kicking from the Low Country is to be considered a black martial art that belongs to the African diaspora, such as capoeira in Brazil and Laja in the French Caribbean. There is evidence that Black American kicking, evasive, and rhythm-linked fighting traditions on U.S. soil have been intermixed into modern-day fighting styles. In the Black Atlantic world, combat and dance were not always cleanly separated. Obi's work has been discussed specifically in terms of public combat, performance, and embodied reputation in slavery-era communities where participation, movement, and display mattered alongside winning. That means that knocking and kicking was not about just landing blows, but it was also about rhythm, posture, timing, and style in motion, which means that it wasn't enough to just knock out your opponent. Oh no, you had to style and profile on them a little bit. And when you hear all of this, you begin to realize that a lot of Black American dance history actually started out a little bit differently than what some people might think. If we were to look at some of the greatest black dancers in American history, from Michael Jackson to James Brown to Bobby Brown to Chris Brown to Tina Turner to Cab Calloway to Snake Hips Tucker and so many others, well, you begin to see these movements that look like flying kicks, spinning kicks, punches, feints, drops, evasions, and combat rhythms. We see the body cutting angles. We see explosive leg lifts. We see spinning attacks turn into performance. We see a kind of sharp, almost militarized cadence in certain movements, especially when rhythm and discipline come together. That doesn't mean that every Black American dance movement is a secret fight movement, but it does mean that in Black American culture, dance and combat have often shared a language of rhythm, posture, feint, display, and sudden force. And that makes sense if knocking and kicking is understood as a form of dance fighting rather than a purely sportified martial arts system. One aspect of the ninja that stands out are all the tales of the secret hidden ninja villages in popular media, video games, and even anime. Like, for example, in the Naruto anime, you have the hidden villages, like the village hidden in the leaves or hidden in the mist, or several other villages that exist in places that are hard to reach, where covert operations are carried out by warriors belonging to their separate village. And I'm gonna tell you, that is an almost one-to-one comparison with the secret Black American hidden villages known as the Maroon Colonies and the Black Maroons. You see, Black Maroons were these enslaved Black people who escaped and then lived on their own or built independent communities in swamps, forests, and other difficult terrain where they were less likely to be found, and even if someone knew where they were, reaching them was rather difficult.
The Great Dismal Swamp once covered nearly 1 million acres between northeastern North Carolina and southeastern Virginia. Between 1620 and around the time of the Civil War, it served as a thriving refuge for runaway slaves who chose to build their lives here in freedom, no matter the conditions.
You have venomous snakes biting insects and flies, thick cover of greenbriers. A great place as a refuge for wildlife, not as much probably a great place refuge for people.
As many as 50,000 runaway slaves, called Maroons, an indigenous term, settled here on small rises of land known as Mesic Islands.
Now you are already seeing the comparison with the ninja hidden village and the foundational Black American hidden villages that operated in the same way. Because the Black Maroons were not just fugitives running blindly. No, instead, these were people choosing terrain that could conceal them, protect them, and help them survive outside of the reach of plantation power. And that terrain mattered. The Black Maroons were known to hide in swamps, and those swamps were not just a backdrop, it was part of the strategy. In fact, the National Park Service explains a crucial detail about the Underground Railroad, in that many early freedom seekers first fled to the Maroon colonies that were located in remote and rugged terrain before later crossing state or national borders. In other words, before there were polished hero narratives about neat escape routes, there were hidden black settlements in hard landscapes. The swamp, the forest, the marsh, the edge of settled space. These were the places where black freedom could exist in half shadow. They were difficult for white authorities to navigate, difficult to map out, difficult to police, and therefore ideal for survival. The Great Dismal Swamp is one of the clearest examples. The National Park Service notes that the Great Dismal Swamp Maroons persisted from the colonial era all the way up into the Civil War, and even beyond that, and that their settlements held powerful symbolic value far beyond their numbers. The Black Maroons didn't just survive, no, they were located right smack dab in the South, surrounded by slave plantations. And they would go around burning down these plantations and doing rescue missions to free enslaved black people. That means that the Black Maroons were not merely hiding. Oh no, they were maneuvering. They were using the swamp as a base of operations. That is what makes the ninja comparison so appropriate, because the hidden village is not where you just sleep. It is where you regroup, where you plan, where you disappear, and where you strike from. And that is why Black Maroons should not be imagined as passive runaways that were hiding in the mud. They were tacticians. They had to know which path could be walked, which waters could be crossed, where food could be found, where patrols were likely to travel, which sounds carry in the dark, how loud they could talk or how low they had to speak, and how to move without giving themselves away. This was all possible because swamp space lacks the clear kind of spatial logic that is recognizable to ordinary state power. The swamp was confusing to outsiders and legible to insiders. It punished the untrained and protected the knowledgeable. This is also why the word village matters so much. Maroon settlements were not just one person hiding alone in the woods or in the swamp. They could be communities, camps, and semi-stable social worlds. That matters because it shows these were not only moments of flight, they were places of life. Places where black people built refuge outside of the plantation system. Places where survival became social and organized. In pop culture, the hidden ninja village is a place where knowledge is protected and passed down away from hostile eyes. Black Maroon colonies did that in the hardest sense possible. They made freedom physically real in places slavery could not fully swallow. And once you understand that, the tactical side becomes even clearer. Maroons are similar to the ninja, not because they wore the same clothes or used the same weapons, but because they survived through concealment, terrain knowledge, disciplined movement, hidden settlement, and strategic invisibility. They knew how to move through forests and swamps where others got lost. They knew how to make themselves difficult to track. They knew how to turn hostile geography into protection. And in some cases, like the Dismal Swamp Maroons, they knew how to turn the hidden refuge into offensive capability as well. Ninja are said to have great abilities related to illusion. And in the modern day pop culture, you have anime like Naruto where you have this special ability that is almost magical, and genjutsu is an illusion that is cast by the user that makes people think they are seeing something that is actually not there, or they can cast a large illusion that can confuse multiple people all at once.
Genjutsu is primarily any technique that could be used to create an impression or an illusion of some sort to distract or occupy your opponent, and it can be used in multifaceted ways. One example might be that dressing up in some sort of costume or even a scary mask, and coming up upon some would-be attackers and scaring them with that mask would be one idea of creating a scary influence that might help you in your survival tactic. So that would be one example of what genjutsu is, in creating an illusory effect to win some sort of altercation.
And what if I told you that Black Americans have their own version of a genjutsu, except it's not magical, but psychological? Because during slavery, we had a lot of slave masters under a genjutsu, and we did it in the most hilarious way possible. And like I said, it's not magical, it is strategic masking, feigning ignorance, deceptive compliance, trickster intelligence, and hidden communication. The point of a foundational Black American, or a salon genjutsu, and salon is another way of saying a Black descendant of American slaves, is that you have to make the white enslavers misread what they are seeing. In practice, that could mean acting clumsy, slow, confused, submissive, harmless, or content while actually resisting, gathering information, protecting others, or creating an opening for escape.
Enslaved people responded to and resisted slavery in all kinds of ways all the time. They did this in sort of huge, extraordinary ways every now and then. So sometimes enslaved people risked their lives by gathering together and revolting. You know, they might do something like Nat Turner's Rebellion, which happened in Southampton County in Virginia in the middle of the 1800s. But those were really rare. Most of the time, enslaved people did what we call everyday resistance. So they resisted slavery in tiny little ways every day. So enslaved people might, if they were picking cotton, they might pick really slowly and just not pick a lot that day. They might, if they were asked to go get water from the stream, they might walk really slowly so that they had a little more free time while they were on the walk and they were on their own. You know, they might do things that were extreme, but still subtle. Like they might poison the food of the person who owned them, or just make them kind of sick, things like that.
One of the clearest examples of the genjutsu that Black Americans had white enslavers under was the fact that we could make them lose profits and we could ruin their farms by performing clumsy behavior to hide resistance, such as breaking tools, accidentally starting fires, which was not actually an accident, working slowly, or performing so carelessly that resistance could be dismissed as incompetence. And the best part about this Black American genjutsu is that white enslavers often took this as proof that enslaved people were docile, clumsy, or unintelligent, which means that enslaved people were actively exploiting racist assumptions for cover. In other words, the oppressor believed a false version of reality so that Black Americans could survive within that reality. Another version was feigning illness, or literally playing possum. A Princeton review and literary work explains that feigning illness was an effective, albeit dangerous, way for enslaved people to resist slaveholders and gain relief from labor. There were claims that pregnant enslaved women were often suspected by enslavers of playing possum to avoid work. But those same enslavers understood that those pregnant women could not work as hard as the others, and those pregnant women would milk that a little bit. Or sometimes some women would actually fake being pregnant. In other words, the enslaved could manipulate the master's perception of their body and condition in order to buy time, reduce labor, or escape punishment. That is deceptive bodily performance as resistance. And in fact, you would have slaves who would break so many tools and they would intentionally cause animals to just pass away, and thus it was an enormous financial liability to have these slaves around. And sometimes that didn't work out well for the slave, but if you're going to enslave me, then I am not obligated to make your life easy. And sometimes the slave masters would allow these slaves to keep the books, as sometimes you had some light-skinned slaves who were actually taught to read. But the problem for the slave master is that some of those light-skinned slaves would often turn on them, and thus they would keep the books in a way where a farm or a farm operation could not be profitable, and they would work hand in hand with the slaves who were in the field to financially hurt the white slave owner. And this would continue for so long that the white enslaver wouldn't notice that they are hemorrhaging money. And all of this is possible because they were under a genjutsu.
But then the other thing that I think is really important when we think about resistance to slavery is that enslaved people stayed alive and they survived and they made families and they made communities and they created this amazing thing that we now know and love called Black culture.
There is a more cultural and psychological version of this trickster tradition. The College of Charleston points out that enslaved people listened to gullible trickster tales like Brer Rabbit, and that these stories carried coded messages about how to survive enslavement. And the message was very clear, and that is the strongest or largest do not always win, and the powerless can rely on wits, ingenuity, and intellect to trick their way out of dangerous situations. That means that Brer Rabbit as a story was not just about entertainment. It was a mental survival tool that was masked as a children's story. It taught you that direct force is not your only weapon, because you also have misdirection, apparent weakness, and making the oppressor underestimate you so that you can find your path towards freedom. And the other type of genjutsu is the religious genjutsu. You know, you had Black American Hoodoo, which is the Black American traditional healing practice that was not always a healing practice, but we'll get to that in the next chapter. But anyways, about Hoodoo, you have this concept called the invisible church. And so in the modern day, you can see Hoodoo practices that have been absorbed into the modern day Christian church, and especially in the American South. And the invisible church is when slaves would openly practice Hoodoo and mix in Christian beliefs so as to psychologically disarm the slave master. And thus the slave master didn't realize that we were practicing a spiritual belief that was tied to healing, poisoning, and also liberation. And this was not the only secret practice that Black Americans had, because you have a covert world of secret meetings, coded songs, and hidden spaces. If you do any research into the secrecy of Black Americans, you would learn about the concepts of hush harbors and brush arbors, which are secret sanctuaries where enslaved Black people gathered beyond the direct surveillance of white control. And several writings about slave songs explicitly frames them as always evading the eyes of others, and those songs carry layered meanings under the watch. The pattern here is consistent, and that is enslaved Black Americans repeatedly built systems in which the visible surface and real meaning were not the same thing. Remember, the slave masters thought that we were all ignorant, and so we used that against them. Sure, you think I'm dumb? Okay, bet. And so we actually used the presumed ignorance of Black Americans against the slave master. And once again, we would break tools and cause fires and cause all kinds of property damage. And the slave master really couldn't get mad, because if you're assuming that we're stupid, then why would you give a stupid person a bunch of tools or trust that person to take care of your animals? Basically, our Black American genjutsu was not just a psychological illusion, but it was very costly for the slave masters. The ninja had various healing arts, and those same arts were used for poisoning, and Black Americans had something very, very similar. If there is a Black American comparison to the healing arts of the ninja, then it would have to be Black American Hoodoo, which is a spiritual tradition created by enslaved Black Americans that includes herbal healing, ancestral veneration, divination, sacred music, and charms for protection against physical harm. And that is a direct comparison to ninjutsu that did not just include training with disguise and escape, but also in medicine. And that matters because Hoodoo was never just magic in the childish sense. Hoodoo included root work, herbal remedies, bodily care, and protective magic in a world where enslaved Black Americans could not rely on white institutions for safety, medical respect, or bodily autonomy. The main practitioners were called root doctors or conjure women, and the conjure woman term is linked to Hoodoo also being referred to as conjure, with the idea that the Hoodoo practitioner could just conjure something out of thin air, or it follows the principle of making a way out of no way. Britannica says ninjutsu also included herbalism, where you had the ninja who would go out into forests and other natural environments and collect ingredients, just like Black Americans would collect ingredients for their hoodoo practice. And on average, you could find at least one hoodoo practitioner on every slave plantation, because there was no such thing as a hospital back then, and there certainly was no ER. So when a slave got whipped or they were harmed while working, it was up to the root doctor doctor or the conjure woman to bring that person back to health. And despite all of the suspicion that was attached to conjure women and also root doctors about poisoning, the slave masters found it useful to have the conjure woman or the root doctor around because the slave masters spent so much money on those slaves, and hoodoo would allow those slaves to survive for a lot longer than they would have if they received no medical care whatsoever. But you see, there was a problem with hoodoo as far as the white enslaver was concerned. You see, hoodoo was a double-edged sword. It could heal someone, but that same knowledge could also harm.
Enslaved people responded to and resisted slavery in all kinds of ways all the time. They might do things that were extreme, but still subtle, like they might poison the food of the person who owned them or just make them kind of sick, things like that.
Just like the ninja, hoodoo practitioners would also create poison, and that poison was sometimes used to get rid of slave masters, and especially slave masters who were particularly brutal. Under slavery, white people feared that black knowledge of plants, roots, medicine, and conjure could be turned against them. That fear was not marginal. That fear became part of the legal and social structure of slavery itself. And the way that you know that a lot of slaves were poisoning people was that in multiple states, there were laws that specifically targeted slaves who would poison their masters. Contrary to popular belief, this was widespread because the two states that imported more slaves than most any other state, and especially South Carolina, made laws due to the fear of slaves poisoning the masters. And the two states that I'm talking about are South Carolina and Virginia. In South Carolina, the 1740 Slave Code made poisoning a capital crime for enslaved people, and later on in Virginia, you had laws that specifically linked enslaved medical practices and poison potions to criminal punishment. That tells us something immediately, and that is that white enslavers believed black people possessed dangerous hidden knowledge that could move quietly, invisibly, and was absolutely lethal. In popular imagination, the ninja's poison hand is terrifying because it turns what looks small into something deadly. The threat is hidden. Everything on the surface looks ordinary, but the danger is already there. Charleston historian Nick Butler points out that proving poisoning was difficult because we are in the 18th century, science was limited. So even if you thought a black slave might have poisoned a slave master, well, good luck trying to prove it. In other words, the fear was not only about confirmed poisonings, it was also about the idea that black people could make white Americans sick without warning, without spectacle, and without a visible battlefield. Hoodoo sits right in the middle of that fear. Scholarship on Black American hoodoo makes it clear that in the antebellum South, poison and conjure were often conceptually tangled together. A 2022 John Hopkins preprint by H.K. Hicks notes testimony in which poison could function almost like a synonym for conjured, and where people believed a conjurer could both cure poison and lay poison. That is one reason why white Southerners were so unsettled by black healers and conjurers. They would depend on black medical knowledge, but they also feared it. The healer and the poisoner could appear dangerously close in the white imagination. That paradox runs through slavery-era black life. Black healers were often respected inside black communities and even consulted by white people, and yet they were also watched with heavy suspicion. A Virginia Tech thesis on slave healers summarizes that enslaved healers were often suspected of murder by poisoning in ways that white physicians were not, which is a tacit admission that Black American hoodoo for the longest time was superior to any white medical healing practice, because that was a way of the conjure woman or the root doctor to keep some white people in check. Because if you're going to come to me for medical assistance or for healing, and I find out that you lynched someone, then maybe that potion that I'm gonna give you might be laced with something. And there were real historical cases and fears behind that image. Scholarship on slavery and law points out that repeated prosecutions of enslaved people for poisoning in places like Virginia, and a 2025 legal history article also shows that between 1740 and 1785, more enslaved Virginians stood trial for poisoning than for any other crime except stealing. Other sources show how deeply this fear shaped white legal culture, with Virginia broadside evidence from 1754 documenting investigations into enslaved women accused of poisoning, and later scholarship describing white fear of poisoning in Virginia as borderline hysteria. So when slaveholders imagined hidden black danger, poison was one of the top fears. Poison in the history of slavery was terrifying to slaveholders precisely because it represented a form of resistance that did not require open combat. If even a black woman who's a conjure woman can put you 6 feet under with her poison, then that was too much of a threat. That is why the ninja comparison to the poison hand technique and also the healing arts makes so much sense. Oftentimes, the ninja could use the idea that they coated all of their weapons in poison as a psychological fear tactic, much in the same way that root doctors and conjure women could strike fear in the hearts of white Americans with just the idea of them being poisoned, while at the same time, the root doctor and the conjure woman was seen in the opposite way and as heroes to the black American slave.